So before concluding, I'll mention just briefly 2 other projects that FSTC delivered this year. The first was the development of an application paper on group corporate governance. It builds on an issue paper on corporate governance that was published in 2014. The application paper aims to provide good practices for the supervision of group corporate governance and reflects the fact that groups can be organized in different ways, some of them being more centralized than others. And the paper has application for the supervision of insurance groups, not just IAIGs, but it may be particularly useful in the case of more complex structures. The application paper will be included in the public background call on November 22nd. I'll conclude with the work that the Financial Stability Technical Committee has done this year related to the identification of systemically important insurers. Last month, the IAIS completed its annual GSI exercise and presented the results to the FSB. Approximately 50 firms participate in the exercise and have been contributing to the data collection each year. The exercise involves a 5-phase process. The 5 phases includes running the several quantitative indicators as well as more qualitative components to produce an overall assessment. We expect that the FSB will announce their decisions relating to the GSIs in the next few weeks. As for the next few years, the IAIS work plan calls for further improvements to the GSI assessment methodology as part of the next scheduled 3-year review that concludes in 2019. In the meantime, the IAIS will collect data from participating insurers and perform their annual GSI exercise using the 2016 assessment methodology. And as Alberto will describe, the IAIS will also pursue the development of an activities-based assessment approach to systemic risk in insurance. So with that overview, turn it back to you, Vicki.
Thank you very much, Elise. Before asking the audience to ask you questions, I wonder whether you have any thoughts, given that we have a lot of industry representatives in the room, of how they could support further development of some of the projects that you have. And in particular, is there any message you would like to give to insurers from this region in Southeast Asia?
Well, thank you for the question. There are many opportunities for stakeholders to participate, and we've talked about the various field testing exercises. There are also stakeholder meetings to participate. There is also a number of opportunities to do research on ICS, for example, ICS-related material. And I think in terms of any messages to provide for firms from this region, I think it'd be particularly useful to have their input so that we can really reflect a ICS that is truly a global standard and reflective of the business models of this region.
Thank you very much. I think this is particularly important as we're moving towards ICS version 2.0, and we will be consulting on the details of its design later in the summer of 2018. It will be particularly important for our members to contribute to this exercise, so that we can take into account the specificities of the products and markets when we launched the consultation. Questions from the audience? Yes? A familiar face? I know who you are, but would you like to say your name?
My name is Tom Fennell, and I'm just here today on my own behalf. But just a question. I wonder if you can clarify about the monitoring period. Currently, for example, with the BCR, it was adopted and firms continue to report that data, but it's consistent with the same specs, if you will, that were adopted initially by the IAIS. So it's kind of static, and it's that same formula that's being reported on each successive year. Is that what you have in mind for the monitoring period, where what's adopted for the ICS in 2019, that version will be kind of locked down, and the firms would report on that set of specs 2020, 2021, 2022? Or is it like the field testing just keeps on going, where there's continual improvement and perhaps some changes to calibration and other things ongoing during that 5-year period? I'm just trying to understand that.
It's a very good question, Tom. The answer is it's the former. That is, we intend to develop a set of specs that towards a highly converged ICS, so much less data, cells to fill for people, that then will go into a monitoring period. Field testing stops from the beginning of implementation of 2020, and obviously those national supervisors that want their firms to, at their own option, at the supervisor's option, to also fill in information on GAP Plus and internal models, will be doing so. And this is what we will be monitoring over the 5-year period. Any other questions?
Hello, David Vaca, representing my own firm. Question on supervisory college discussion of the results of the ICS. Is there going to be guidance given and expectations for the discussions among the colleges, ensuring that there's a feedback loop to ensure that you're getting the desired effect from the discussion in the colleges and enough is being discussed? Are you looking for information from the colleges based on that discussion to come back into the ICS or the IAIS to feed?
David, that's the expectation that we, although we haven't developed that yet, that sort of guidance, but that's the expectation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious about the use of the word mandatory. Can you just elaborate on how this becomes mandatory post-2019?
So obviously the IAIS cannot mandate anything, but it can publish standards. So it will be up, and the standard would say that we expect if a supervisor wants to meet the IAIS ICS version 2.0, they would need to require their firm to report on a particular basis to be decided by the national supervisor. What quality, for example, they would like to see would be a national supervision decision to report to the supervisory college on this particular basis. I mean, let me say that a number of volunteers, almost 50 companies, have already been completing field testing templates with many, many, many cells. Now, this completion has been done on a best efforts basis. My expectation is that in terms of, if you want burden to the industry of reporting, is that I would expect that there will be much less data to fill in, but most supervisors will expect, because this will be submitted to the Supervisory College, to be done on the bar in terms of quality will be raised. But ultimately, this is a national supervisory decision. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elise. And now let's move to Alberto, the chair of the Systemic Risk Assessment Task Force.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Happy to give you a brief update of the work we are carrying out in developing the activity-based approach, but more in general about developing a framework for IAIS to mitigate the systemic risk in insurance. I would like to start with a slide just listing the work that IAIS have done up to now, since 2011 to 2016, IAIS has issued a number of documents. Actually, I don't want to go through this document, but I think it's very important to understand that what we are doing now, even though looking at a different perspective, which is the activity-based approach, in addition to the entity-based approach, we are actually consistent with all the concept and the consideration that we have done up to now. And in the work of the ABA, we are actually building on the concept that we have developed over time. And this is important because I think we should not see the development of the ABA as a completely different framework, a completely different approach compared to what we have done up to now. I will give this update by making reference to the tasks that my task force should carry out. And as we said in Windsor, these tasks are, related to an holistic development of how systemic risk could be mitigated in insurance. This includes a first work stream that is the development of an activity-based approach, a second work stream that relates to addressing consistency aspects, both in the methodology for designating GSII and in the field of activity-based approach, consistency between sectors, what is done particularly in the banking sector and in the insurance sector. And in particular, this work stream relates to the way in which insurance subgroups of banking conglomerates are treated in the GSIB methodology, and how banking subgroups of insurance-led conglomerates are treated in the GSII methodology. And the third work stream relates to the triennial revision of the GSII methodology to identify systemically relevant institutions. As you can see, this task allows us to tackle the issue of systemic risk in an holistic way, and I think this is the added value of this work. Also here, the sequence of the work is quite important, because we will take care of the revision of the GSII methodology when we will have conclusion on ABA, and so therefore we will have a conclusion on to what extent ABA will be able to mitigate systemic risks. So our purpose is to build something which is consistent. The timeline of the work is, I think, is known. The 3 work streams should be concluded in 2019 for implementation 2020. There will be a final consultation paper the end of 2018, and we committed ourselves to issue also an interim consultation paper at the end of this year. Actually, in few weeks it will be issued. That relates in particular on the work that we have done on the first work stream, the development of an activity-based approach. The purpose of this consultation, interim consultation paper, is actually to update on the work that we have done and to show which are the issues that we are looking at, and in some cases also the direction that we are taking in solving those issues, and all that in order to get an early feedback from you that could inform the work that we are going to do next year in view of the final consultation paper. Actually, this consultation paper has also the purpose to foster interest by all stakeholders. As we have said many times, ABA is something that do not interest only big groups, but the whole sector. I have to say that in any case, the interest and the expectation on the activity-based approach is already building up very much, and this is something that I and the task force actually honestly feel on our shoulders, and we really hope to live up with the expectation. So this consultation paper will not presenting conclusive proposals, just issues and direction of the work. I think I could give, even the consultation paper is to be issued in some weeks. I can give some highlights on the content of this consultation paper without entering into the details. This consultation paper, first of all, will try to clarify the concept of activity-based approach, what we mean for activity-based approach, and will describe what will be our process in developing any policy measure that could mitigate systemic risk under an activity-based approach. Yeah, this is those are some sentences with regard to the concept. We try to define ABA as an approach to mitigate systemic risk through broadly applicable policy measure addressing potentially systemically risky activity across institutions. So there are two main elements here to focus. The fact that we speak about risk exposure across companies. The issue here is to identify which are the risks that, in case of a certain event, could create correlated responses from a number of companies that through certain transmission channel are able, potentially, to create an impact on the system. So the approach is different from an entity-based approach when we try to identify which are the risk exposure that a single institution could have that are able to create externalities in case of a failure of this institution. So according to the ABA approach, we are not speaking about the knock-on effect of a failure of one institution, but we are speaking about the possible common, aggregated, synchronized reactions from a number of companies that are exposed to correlated risks. And those reactions could potentially impact the system. And this includes risks that could be created, exposure to risk that could be created both through insurance activity, reinsurance activity, and non-insurance activities. The focus here, differently from what we had when we issued the NTNI paper, is to identify which are the risk exposure that in some way could be created. But the approach will be the same. We will try to have an economic approach, not a legalistic approach that focuses on the risks, the transmission channels, and the potential impacts on the system. Even though with a different approach in these slides, just to clarify even better what an activity-based approach means, we underline the difference between the activity-based approach and the entity-based approach. There are differences that relates on the type of assessment. As I said, we are not speaking about the effect of a failure of a single company. We are speaking about the impact of many failure, or many distress, or many synchronized responses to a certain event. The type of impact is different. We are not speaking a so-called domino effect, that is the shock that could be propagated from one company to others. We are speaking about the so-called tsunami effect, so correlated action. And as a consequence, also the policy measures have a different scope of application, because according to the entity-based approach, there are policy measures that are specifically applied to certain institutions that are considered systemically relevant according to the methodology. In the activity-based approach, in principle, any policy measure that will be considered appropriate will be applied to all companies. Exactly because each company, not individually, but together with the other companies, could contribute to potential systemic impacts. I would like now just to give some highlights of the approach we are using for developing policy measures. So ABA, at the end, from a concrete point of view, will be a package of policy measures that are able to mitigate the risk of impact due to aggregated responses or action by companies. So the first, we try to clarify this process by making reference to steps. The first step is actually to identify which is the activity, but the second step is to evaluate which are the current existing policy measures that already mitigate the risk stemming from those activities, and then to check whether there is some gaps, to see whether there are certain weaknesses in the supervisory toolkit that needs to be addressed. And this is the final step, which is the design of any additional policy measure or the enhancement of current policy measures that are able to fill those gaps. With regard to the first step, which I see is the main focus of the consultation paper, because it's most of the work that we have done up to now, while on the other steps in the consultation paper you will find less details, just some very preliminary consideration. The first step is the identification of the activities. Here I have to anticipate that as we have done on an NP&I paper, we consider not the activity as such, in particular not the legal form of the activity, but we focus on the risk exposure that the activity could create. So the focus here from a more substantial point of view is on the risk exposure rather than on the legal form of the activity. So we will identify risk exposure, not different levels of activities. And this could be helpful both for considering the whole balance sheet of the companies, taking into account the assets, liability, and the interaction between the two, for considering any mitigation mechanism that has been put in place by the company, and also for avoiding difficulties in the application or regulatory arbitrage that could be due to the legal classification of the activities. And I can also anticipate that in this work we will actually, our starting point has been the work that has been already done by IAIS. As I said before, we already identify certain risk categories that are relevant, in the evaluation of a systemic risk. And in particular, our focus will be on two main risk exposure, which are liquidity risk and exposure to macroeconomic factors. In addition, however, we are considering also other types of risk exposure or other type of situation, like, for example, exposure to a certain type of operational risk. We discussed about the cyber risk, for example. And we are analyzing to what extent those type of exposure could create, in case of the risk materialize, correlated, aggregated action or reaction from companies that could impact the system. So we build on the previous work. I don't think you will be surprised to see which are the risk exposure that we are focused on. It is clear that those risk exposures are not approached in a binary way. We are not saying when a risk exposure is systemic and when it's not systemic. Everything depends on the measurement of those risk exposure. The second step is the stock take of the current standard, and I think what is important here to say that we'll make reference to, obviously, to the IAIS supervisory toolkit, but also to relevant policy measures that are issued by other international standard setters, to the extent that they are relevant for the activity on insurance. We can think about FSB or IOSCO measure on derivatives, for example. The gap analysis will be a key valuation in this process, Obviously, most of the evaluation will be qualitative, but as far as possible, we will try to include the quantitative elements that support any conclusion that we are going to draw. Fourth step, final, we will try to design, if necessary, any policy measure. What I would like to say that obviously we are very aware that we, in this phase, the design of the policy measure we think should consider any mitigation mechanism put in place by the companies. And again, the focus on the risk exposure could help in that. And the other key elements of this step is the fact that besides designing any new measure, we should also evaluate what is the right scope of application of those measures, and possibly also make explicit the need to refer to the principle of proportionality. So proportionality consideration and also cost-benefit analysis will be criteria that we are going to use in defining the scope of application of any policy measure. I just wanted to say that since we focus on risk exposure, in general there are already many policy measures that are designed for mitigating the probability of failure of the single company, and therefore they have a micro purpose that could also play a role, an important role, in mitigating the systemic risk under an ABA approach. I'll conclude here. I hope you will enjoy the consultation paper, and we look forward. I think there is Christmas in between, so you have time to read. I look forward to your inputs. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto, for describing our members' Christmas present. Questions, please. Hugh.
Thank you, Vicky. Hugh Saville, Association of British Insurers. Alberto, some of the potentially risky activities, I'm thinking of derivatives, but there are others. Some of these risky activities also have a risk-absorbing function and contribute to stability as well. And I was wondering whether the IAIS would take that into account when considering these activities.
Yeah, the answer is yes. This is actually what I meant by making reference to the focus on the net risk exposure of the balance sheet. So derivatives in themselves are not potentially systemically risky. Obviously, it depends on how they are designed and how they are used.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm not sure, as an outsider a bit on this group, to what extent you consider sovereign risks in this matter, and to what extent you go into this territory, and if not, is there any thought of dealing with this, since you are talking about systemic risks? And coming from the sovereign risk assessments and literature and practice, we do see a purpose to go in this direction, but we don't know the details behind your schedule there and thoughts.
I'm wondering why you're asking this question, because I'm Italian. No, but we are not tackling directly sovereign risk, but all the risk, including spread risk, including interest rate risk, could create correlated reaction when the exposure is too concentrated and it is too widespread in certain markets. So indirectly, this issue is taken into account. This is my consideration. I hope the Italian government is not listening.
Yes, sir. Yes, and the lady after you at the back.
Okay, my name is Hiro Hayasaki, and I have two questions. First question is a very simple one. Are you going to eliminate the entity-based approach, or will the EBA and ABA coexist, or you haven't decided it yet? That's the first question. And the second question is, the IAIS, you announced that you are going to make a change to the ICS version 2, and I guess from 2020 you're getting into the monitoring period. And does this have any impact on the GSII project? Because you cannot use the ICS as a basis for capital surcharge from 2020.
Yeah, two very good questions. I will try to. As to the first one, no, it was not decided yet whether the ABA will complement or replace the entity-based approach. But as I said, we will work on the entity-based approach once we have a clearer view on the ability of the activity-based approach to mitigate risks. And as I said, many of the risk categories that we are addressing in the activity-based approach are also the categories that are included in the GSII methodology. So there is some consideration to do when evaluating the two approaches in the same way. But we are not in the position to answer whether it will replace or complement yet. The other question, yes, obviously the HLA is supposed to be built upon a capital requirement. Depending on the availability of these capital requirements, you can have a different solution. This is an issue that has to be discussed. But the fallback position in any case is to apply HLA on the BCR, and which is something that I think nobody consider the optimal solution. The best would be to have a risk-sensitive capital requirements. I just wanted to say that in relation to ICS, that ICS in itself could end up to be a capital requirement. That before being a capital requirement is a way for measuring the risk exposure. So certainly the ICS of some kind of stress test-based measurement metric is relevant also in the case of activity-based approach, because it helps to have a single metric to measure the exposure, and therefore to make an evaluation to aggregated exposure at the market level. So certainly, the ICS, not as a capital requirement, as a way for measuring the exposure is a relevant concept for ABA.
The lady?
Thank you,
Yes,
Vicky.
madam.
Thank you, Alberto. My name is Wei Huan. I'm here on behalf of Ping An Insurance Group in China. I personally appreciate IAIS efforts throughout the time to develop new assessment methodology to resolve so many key concerns among GSIs. I noticed on the materials provided by Alberto that this ABA approach is intended to resolve the cross-sectoral systemic risk assessment issue. I understand that FSB also have been promoting 3 frameworks among the insurance sector, banking sector, and the non-banking, non-insurance sectors to evaluate the systemic risk based on institutions. So how would this ABA approach developed by IAIS to incorporate or recognize the systemic risk assessment approach developed by the other 2 frameworks? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe I forgot to say when I made my presentation that those cross-sectoral aspects are key in our project, but are not exclusively related to the activity-based approach. Actually, they are mainly related to the methodology for designating the activities. And as I said, one of the main purposes in this project is to improve the way in which banking subgroups of insurance-led conglomerate are treated in the GSII methodology, but in the overall complex of the 2 methodology. A task force, a specific task force, joint task force with the composed of a representative of IAIS and Basel Committee had been established, and this task force is actually working on those aspects. So ABA directly will not solve this problem, but indirectly I think could help, because it could in some way change the emphasis on the entity-based approach and therefore on the methodology. But this is, as I said, a main object of our work, but is not directly addressed by activity-based approach.
Thank you. I suggest we move on to Ekram Serpa for his update of the Implementation Committee.
Thank you. So, good morning, everyone. I'm going to give a brief update about the work of the IAIS's Implementation Committee. Our work has largely been driven by the Coordinated Implementation Framework from 2013. And to date, our work has been focused on 4 primary areas: implementation monitoring, supervisory capacity building, financial inclusion, and supervisory cooperation. But as you've heard, there are a lot of developments happening right now in the world of insurance, and not just in our standard setting body, but the world around us is changing and moving from post-crisis policy development to ensuring the implementation of standards, and ultimately ensuring their effective and consistent implementation by members of standard setting bodies. So this is an exciting time for implementation. So as a result, we've been focused this year on some various changes to review and enhance our work streams. This year we looked at the external developments affecting the implementation world, and we looked at whether the Coordinated Implementation Framework from 2013 was still valid and relevant. One of the primary focuses we had in mind was how do we ensure that the IAS continues to enhance its focus for its emerging market and developing economy members, which makes up a substantial part of the IAS membership? So this coordinated implementation framework review was launched, and ultimately our conclusions were that the 2013 CIF remained valid. However, we needed to refocus our activities on the areas that are important for implementation going forward. We looked at what is the role of the IAS and how do we ensure that emerging market focus. And we concluded with a 4-pillar approach. Assessment and implementation monitoring will be a primary foundation for our work. Capacity building will be another cornerstone, with additional focuses on supervisory cooperation and practices. So turning to the first element, assessments and implementation monitoring. As I mentioned, this is at the core of all of our IAS implementation work. This year we managed to complete 2 additional self-assessment and peer reviews, one on market conduct, ICPs 18 and 19, and then the reinsurance and macroprudential surveillance assessment, ICPs 13 and 24. Both of these aggregated reports are available on the IAS website for your download. Additionally, we launched a review of implementation of GSI policy measures. And this was the first time we've looked at this, so this will be a multi-year phased approach looking at these for the group-wide supervisors. Going forward in 2018, we intend to strengthen our IAS assessment program with enhanced peer review processes, a member review process, and additional self-assessment tools. We're coming to the end of the first round of self-assessment and peer reviews, and we've completed over 1,000 self-assessment and peer reviews since 2011, and over 130 jurisdictions have participated and 190 standards have been assessed. What we found is that on average 70 jurisdictions have been participating in each of these assessments. Our next slide really kind of gives you an overview of what we found in terms of assessment looking across the different regions of the IAS. So each row effectively illustrates a different region, and the relevant ICPs which have been assessed you can see in the columns. Green indicates a high level of observance, with yellow indicating a minor shortcomings, and red indicating partly observed status. So here you can largely see that the one area that really jumps out is the area of ICP 23, and this was actually one of the first ICPs that, as a result of this self-assessment and peer review work, that was revised and as part of the broader feedback loop. So capacity building is another critical component of our work at the Implementation Committee. The IAS works with its partners to deliver training to supervisors, since the IAS is not a training institute nor technical assistance provider. Our goal is to leverage others, such as the Access to Insurance Initiative, the Financial Stability Institute, and other development banks such as ADB, IDB, World Bank, etc. One of our major success stories to date has been the First One program, which has been a joint initiative with the FSI. We've had over 200 participants in this online training program for new supervisors. And this is the 4th year we're running this program, and over 50 jurisdictions have already participated. We published a capacity building survey this year, and that was a joint project with the Access to Insurance Initiative. It really helped us identify the challenges and the needs for our members. And what we found is that over half of the respondents do not have sufficient resources in order to develop new supervisors. They also indicated that the 3 primary areas that they're interested in focusing on from an implementation perspective and supervisory practices are macroprudential surveillance, market conduct issues, and microinsurance. This is especially true for areas such as Sub-Saharan Africa, the MENA region, and the offshore Caribbean region. Another major project has been our core curriculum refresh, and this is building on a project from 2006 which was joint with the World Bank. This has been supported by nearly 80 volunteers and has been a major success in revising it to date. We've also been able to support our members in the form of providing assistance in kind, but also financial assistance for regional seminars. And this year we've been able to support 9 to date. We also launched additional assistance in the area of actuarial services. And we were able to provide a training program earlier this year in Asia, jointly with the Asia Development Bank's Technical Assistance Program. And coming out of that, you heard Vicky talk about the new agreement that we've signed with the Access to Insurance Initiative and the International Actuarial Association to help provide that capacity building in actuarial services. So supervisory practices, this is one of those areas where we're hearing from our supervisors that they need assistance. They want to be able to share their experiences with each other and learn from each other. Standard setting is important for them. However, they want to know, how do you implement an effective reinsurance supervisory framework? What are the tools needed to oversee intermediaries? How do I prevent insurance fraud in my market? They're looking for practical experiences. And what the implementation committee is going to be doing and has been doing is developing application and issues papers. This year we were able to complete and publish our application paper on mutuals, cooperatives, and community-based organizations, and we're currently working on 3 additional papers related to product oversight in inclusive insurance, a paper on the use of digital technology in inclusive insurance, and an issues paper on index-based insurance. We're also working on case studies related to proportionality in practice and working in consultation with the Access to Insurance Initiative for consultation calls. We've also launched a consultative forum around the areas of microinsurance in partnership once again with the A2II and also the Microinsurance Network. Going forward in 2018, we intend to take more oversight of the creation of application and issues papers in conjunction working with the Policy Development Committee. So supervisory cooperation. This is one of those critical areas that with groups operating throughout the world, supervisors have to be able to share information confidentially and understand that that information will be held confidential. The IAIS Multilateral Memorandum of Understanding is the tool that the IAIS uses and recommends and promotes supervisory cooperation through. Our signatories working group oversees this work and conducts a rigorous review of the IAIS member jurisdictions who apply, and the validation team decides whether those jurisdictions meet the high standards that have been set. I'm pleased to report there were 3 new authorities joining the IAIS MMOU this year: Maryland, Vermont, Oklahoma. So that brings our total signatories to 64 and close to 70% of world premium. You can see the rapid development here from 2009 to 2017, and we have another 12 jurisdictions currently in the validation process. So the application paper on MCCOs, which I mentioned, this really is a paper that addresses the area for companies such as mutuals, mutual benefit organizations, cooperatives, friendly societies, burial societies, fraternal societies, community-based organizations, risk pooling organizations, and self-insurance schemes. So it's a pretty broad paper. And one of the distinguishing features of all of these types of organizations is that they're all member-owned, or their members are involved in the governance. So as a result, the paper looks at how should the ICPs be proportionally applied to these types of organizations. The paper also looks at how could MCCOs be used in an inclusive insurance market environment. The paper provides application guidance on the way the ICPs are applied in a proportionate manner, but also are there specific unnecessary barriers that could be removed, which might lead to disproportionate regulation and supervision. But it's important that policyholder protection is not reduced as a result of this proportionate application of the ICPs. One of the things that the paper also does say is that there is no recommendation that supervisors should give preferential treatment to the MCCOs. And here you can really see the paper really goes in depth and looks at a number of key areas. And I encourage you to take a look at the paper. It's available on our website, and I encourage you to read it and look forward to any comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekram. As I mentioned and you mentioned, the implementation committee under our new structure is going to be renamed Implementation and Assessment Committee, and will have also increased responsibility over the oversight of the production of application papers and issues papers. I wanted to ask you about the particular assessment part. I mean, as you said, we undertook an exercise to try to enhance our assessment activities. Could you say that, in your view, why are assessments important in improving the observance, and how do they actually do it?
Thank you for the question. So assessments are really at the core of our implementation program. They provide a direct benefit to our membership, and we found that they also provide that feedback loop to the standard setting committees. What we're finding is that members are able to conduct assessments and participate in these assessments to understand where there are gaps in their current supervision framework, and then they can use those reports to work with technical assistance providers or consultants or themselves to improve those standards and try to fill those gaps. So we've seen direct benefit as a result of the assessment program over the last few years.
Thank you. Questions to Akram from the audience?
Okay, thank you. I'm Morik Philolov with the Philolov Consulting Group. Ekram, as you know, the FSAP process is changing and being reduced. The FSAPs have provided very valuable information to companies as they're assessing expansion into jurisdictions. They also have served, I think, to validate reforms which various jurisdictions have undertaken. Do you envision a time at which the IAIS might release individual country assessments to help for both those reasons?
Thank you for the question, Morik. So, as part of the revisions to our 2018 assessment program, we'll have three components. One is the peer review process, one is a self-assessment tools, and then the member assessment program. The peer review program really builds on our existing self-assessment and peer review. And within that program, one of the areas which we will be doing is encouraging members to publish their reports and encouraging additional transparency. What we believe is that this will lead to additional ability for benchmarking across jurisdictions, and for jurisdictions to be able to look across and compare themselves to others within their region. Again, this is a purely voluntary exercise, members will be encouraged to publish the reports. So we're hopeful that now that we're 5 years into the program, there's more comfort around publication of the reports. Next year we'll begin with 2 assessments, and hopefully with those 2 assessments we'll see additional reports being published by the membership. We will also be conducting a member assessment program, which is going to be trying to fill the gap, the void that has been left by the IMF and World Bank's slight revisions to the FSAPs. And as you noted, the IMF will focus on systemically important jurisdictions and focus more on systemically important ICPs as opposed to the full range of ICPs. Our goal is to provide support to our membership and conduct full member reviews, but we're still in the process of trying to develop that program. 2018 will be a pilot case, and we're still at the stage of discussing whether that jurisdiction will publish that report. But in the meantime, we'll have the peer review program, which will be a more rigorous assessment going forward and provide guidance to the jurisdictions on how they can improve their observance of the standards, but also where they can identify the gaps in their supervisory framework.
But this question that you asked, Moriad, as Akram said, we are encouraging our members to publish the self-assessment peer reviews already. The issue about member assessments, we are going to be filling in the gap internally, where they will then move to encouragement of publication or some other form. This is to be decided. But it's an issue that we are actively considering.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sporta and Ekram. I'm Steve Simchak with the American Insurance Association. If an IAIS member declines to publish the peer review, will there be any indication that the peer review occurred, but that they've declined to publish the results, or will we not be aware that it happened?
So the IAIS continues to publish aggregate reports on its website and will continue to do so in the future, which will highlight which jurisdictions have participated in the assessments. And while we won't actively say which jurisdictions did not choose to publish, members and stakeholders will be able to determine themselves who chose not to publish at that time just by looking at the website.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Makoto Okubo, and I usually comment on the standard settings parts like ICS, systemic risk, IFRS, but it's sometimes it's good about something else to keep a good life-work balance. So now I'm working in Asia Pacific region as a Sherpa for the APFF Insurance and Retirement Income Workstream, and I'm trying to help emerging market economies in Asia Pacific region to properly implement international standards. So, for example, this is my trip like going around the world, and I just received an email from my wife to ask me when I'm coming back from next. So my first destination was in Vietnam, and APEC finance ministers issued a joint statements to promote infrastructure investment by insurance company and also disaster risk financing and microinsurance. So those topics are very, very relevant to this group, and APEC is now very interested in working together. So now we are having a lot of conferences and meetings under the APFF platform. APFF is not a group of insurance company. We involve all these sectors: banks, securities company, insurance company, consultant, accountants, lawyers, regional organization. And I'm just wondering if IAIS is interested in working with us to discuss something which may go beyond the responsibility of insurance supervisors. This is kind of the area that we can probably provide a good collaboration with you. And a very long story, but this is meant to be a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac, for your question and statement. The IAS partners with a number of organizations and other forums, such as the Sustainable Insurance Forum, and also with other bodies such as the Asian Forum of Insurance Regulators and ATRI and others. So I would encourage you to reach out to the IAS Secretariat and provide more information about how you think that the APFF and the IAS could partner. I think we're always open to exploring what is within the realm of the possible, within the resource boundaries that we have, which are significant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Probably we can help you to have a very long-term friendly regulatory requirements. It's a win-win situation for both of us. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for the interesting presentation at the end. It was a good wrap-up of the activities of IAIS. Among the tools that you are using is the peer review, the self-assessment, and some others. We have in Asia, from the GIZ side, introduced so-called regulatory impact assessment. This is nothing out of the sky, out of the blue. This is basically looking into the market development, mostly of inclusive insurance or microinsurance, as it is called as a buzzword. We are looking into the institutional development. You mentioned the capacities, the need for capacity building, and we're also looking into the financial literacy, education, which means rather consumer protection. The question is here, also based on the challenge that we face, data collection is an issue mostly when this inclusive insurance has not in all jurisdictions been defined clearly. So when we do these assessments of regulatory impact assessment, we face the challenge of where do we put the threshold, what is micro, what is not micro. Some legislation like the Philippines have a very clear qualitative definition. That's a bit easier to get the data from the industry. But in most of the jurisdictions, there is a mismatch there of definition. So it's difficult to collect data, and without data, you cannot move ahead. Yeah, and I mean data in terms of the industry, the basic data, 10, 12 basic ratios that you want to deal with coming out of the financial statements. But the financial statements do not differentiate, as I said, between what is micro, what is not, what policies are considered, but they are more, they include most of this data. So the question directly, not to make it long here, I have a question, is to what extent does data collection play a role in supporting also the various legislations here, but also to what extent are you guiding this, or you plan to guide in the future in a more consistent and a more maybe client-friendly way? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think you raised some interesting points there. 2018, the Implementation Assessment Committee will focus more on supervisory practices such as that potentially, and we're hoping to look at some issues such as ratios, for instance, but work is still to be developed in this area, and hopefully as we refocus on supervisory practices, we can explore some of these areas further.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. Please do ask a question. You've been waiting, but if you could ask briefly, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'm Peter Durand from AIA. I'd like to go back to Elise's presentation. Elise, one of the things you did not touch on is a potential review of ICPs 14 and 17. And what is the plan, if any, for that, and how does it interact with the ICS?
Good question. Elise.
Well, those ICPs will be looked at. I think we need to get a little further along in our development of the ICS, and then we'll take up those ICPs as well. It wouldn't make sense to update them right now, but once we're a little bit further along, we certainly will go back and incorporate them, incorporate the comp frame elements as well into those ICPs.
Yeah, so we will fully develop ICS version 2.0 and for which we are consulting next year with a view of finalizing it in 2019. And then we will look at 14 and 17, given the interactions with valuation and capital. Excellent. Thank you very much, all. And thanks very much to the panelists for the excellent presentations. Thank you.